Hello guys, we are going to start the last section, section 4, and as you can see, there's only 6 slides, so we should be able to get through this fairly quickly. Let's jump right in and see if we can keep this video short. Again, I encourage you to jump ahead to 1.5 or 2 times the speed. I don't know what it is about talking to a computer, but I just speak so slowly, guys. I'm so sorry. I'm trying my best. Um, but this is just so much different than talking to you guys in person. Let's move through this quickly. All right, we are going to be talking about federalism and the Supreme Court. So, actually, to go back to this slide, I first of all, this cracked me up. It kind of looked like a Monty Python sort of cartoon here, but basically, it shows state versus federal government. This is the White House. In reality, the idea, the hope is that there is cooperation between the states and the federal government. They each support one another, they each have their own powers, and they each have their own authority, and the power moves back and forth between the two. And it's not intended to be like a competition. So even though in that cartoon it looked like the two are at odds with each other, that's not always the case. So we are going to be looking at federalism, okay? Basically, the relationship between the states and the federal government. So, section 4 starts with discussing expanding federal authority, okay? So, Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, the states, and Indian tribes, okay? So, Congress often uses the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause, all right? So, Congress has used its power to regulate commerce in trying to end racial discrimination in the United States. So, if you remember, um, in the past, deciding that having segregation in hotels affected interstate commerce. If you remember way back to the beginning of the class, we know that the federal government um, has authority when it comes to regulating commerce in between states or business in between states, right? So in 1964, Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States, the court upheld the use of power, okay? The use of power that the federal government could force private businesses not to discriminate against African Americans. So it was very, very difficult to tackle segregation initially. They had acts that address inequality when it came to voting and things like that, but the government could not force states into doing very much. However, when they started addressing it through business, that is when huge changes started to take place. So in this case, in 1964, the court said that the Heart of Atlanta Motel engaged in interstate commerce since 75% of guests were from out of state, and that this racial discrimination had a disruptive effect on interstate commerce. And because of that decision, suddenly the government was able to go into many different types of businesses, not just hotels, and demand equality. All right. So, question number 16 on your quiz, multiple choice. The answer is A. In which landmark court case did the Supreme Court use the Commerce Clause to fight racial discrimination? A. Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States. Okay? And then question number 15. The doctrine of selective exclusiveness means that Congress has the power to regulate all. B. Commerce that requires national uniform regulation. And so we are going to get on to that next. Actually, we are not getting onto that next, just kidding. I skipped over it. So the Supreme Court's decision when it came to all these different cases basically led to the idea that the court used the doctrine of selective exclusiveness. So selective exclusiveness means that when the commerce at issue requires national uniform regulation, only Congress can regulate it. But if the commerce does not need exclusive national regulation and it can be regulated locally, the states may regulate it. Okay, so several cases came after this motel case. So the next course that came along was Gibbons v. Ogden, which we discussed in chapter 5. Okay, and it was the first interpretation of the Commerce Clause in 1824. After Gibbons, Congress almost never used the Commerce Clause to expand federal government power until the late 1800s. But the Supreme Court laid the groundwork for this use in 1852 with Cooley v. Board of Wardens. Okay, so this decision was never overruled, but as you're gonna see, the doctrine of selective exclusiveness has not been applied automatically or uniformly. Okay, so there's a lot of factors that come into consideration, such as the political leanings of the justices or the court's desire to expand or contract federal power. So there's been, if you remember, back in the beginning of our semester, we were looking at different periods of federalism, dual federalism, cooperative federalism, blah, 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 right? So there's times when the federal government's power expands and the federal government's power contracts. And so depending on sort of what phase we're in, you tend to see these rules applied a little bit differently. So jumping ahead to 1992, we're going to look at the guns in school case, okay? So in 1992, Alfonso Lopez went to school and he had a concealed handgun. One of his friends told on him, and the school authorities confronted Alfonso. He admitted that he had a gun, and he was arrested and charged under Texas law with possessing a firearm. The next day, the state charge was dropped. So the state said, never mind, we're not going to prosecute you because the federal government stepped in and said, you know, we are going to punish him and charge him with a crime. And so the states had to step down and leave room for the federal government to take over. The federal government said that he violated the gun-free school zones law, which makes it illegal for anybody to have a gun at school. Okay, he was convicted in federal court, and then the Circuit Court of Appeals reversed his decision. So then the next logical step, if you remember the 3 levels of the court systems, right? There's the federal court, the Court of Appeals, and then finally Supreme Court. The federal authorities appealed to the Supreme Court, and Lopez's attorney said that this was an unconstitutional exercise of Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. They said, so arguing for the student, having a gun at school might be a crime, it might be dangerous, but it has nothing to do with interstate commerce. Okay? The attorneys for the government argued that if you have guns in school zones, it can lead to violent crime, which would make people afraid to travel to that area. All right? And so basically they said that this could have an effect on the economy, and as a result, it was reasonable for Congress to get involved, for Congress to regulate firearms in school zones and to do so under the Commerce Clause. Okay, so in 1995, the court ruled that the Gun-Free School Zone Act was unconstitutional. Okay, they said that possession of a gun in a school zone was not an economic activity, and therefore it was not appropriate for the federal government to get involved in this way under the Commerce Clause. Okay, so the court had a duty to prevent the federal government from expanding powers to regulate the conduct of a state citizen. All right, so basically, the idea is that it was inappropriate for the federal government to intervene in this way, and that it should have been left to the state to decide what should have happened. All right, that the state should have said, hey, you committed a crime, you can't bring a gun to school, but that the federal government cannot get involved and say, hey, we're going to intervene in this way, and we're going to justify it by doing it under the Commerce Clause. All right, so another case that kind of looks at this is the medical marijuana case. Guys, we are just talking about all kinds of controversial issues in this section, so hold on tight. Again, like I've said in video 2, if you have anything that you think would be interesting to talk about, do so in a comment on the video, either on YouTube or on the tab for videos in Google Classroom. I think that it would be great for you guys to discuss this. So basically, the medical marijuana case was a really interesting case to kind of challenge federalism further, okay? So using marijuana has been illegal under federal law since 1937, but in 1996, California allowed the use of marijuana for medical purposes. So there were 2 Californians, Diane Monson and Angel Rake, who grew their own marijuana, okay, to treat their pain. And in fact, one of them, it was said that her pain was so bad, her doctor actually testified that if she didn't have this to control her pain, she could die, that it was so significant. However, what ended up happening was that federal authorities seized and destroyed the marijuana plants that she was growing. Okay. So Monson and Rake sued the federal government and said that it was not okay for them to intervene with their right to use medical marijuana, that the state law allowed them the use of this, and it was not okay for the federal government to get involved. Long story short, the decision made its way to the Supreme Court. All right. So Rake and Monson claimed that the federal law allowing the seizure of this marijuana was a violation of the Commerce Clause. They were not engaged in interstate commerce. They grew the marijuana themselves. All of the supplies they used in the growing of this marijuana, they got from within the state, and this had absolutely nothing to do with whatsoever the federal government. And so they said that it was completely unconstitutional for this to be taken from them. The government, however, based its argument on the Supremacy Clause. It argued that the federal government, right, does not recognize the medical use of marijuana, and the Constitution is the supreme law over the state. All right? So hopefully a lot of this sounds really familiar to you guys, that you understand the things I'm referencing to, Supremacy Clause, etc. So let's jump ahead. The decision was, let's see, 6-3 to uphold the government's use of the Commerce Clause to seize homegrown marijuana plants. So the court accepted the government's argument that homegrown medical marijuana affects interstate commerce, despite the fact that there was no business in trading marijuana. They felt that the U.S. government did in fact have power when it came to this. All right. So Justice John Paul Stevens' majority opinion noted that marijuana was a popular part of commerce. Okay, and so the Commerce Clause applies whether the commerce is legal or not. So even though the buying and selling of marijuana is illegal against the law, they said it was in fact related to commerce. It was a popular item that people would buy and sell even if it was illegal. So Sandra Day O'Connor had a dissenting opinion, And she said, federalism promotes innovation by allowing a single courageous state, if its citizens choose, to try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. And so she added that principles of federalism should protect California's experiment from federal regulation. So as you can see, this was a pretty controversial decision. All right. So here is where we come to an end. I hope that you guys got a lot out of this. I'm going to go through the last quiz questions that I haven't gone over. Again, if you have any questions, just reach out to me, okay? So question 14, the Supreme Court has supported the national government's use of the Commerce Clause to do all of the following except A, seize marijuana, B, fight racial discrimination, C, regulate interstate commerce, D, regulate firearms in schools. The answer is D, because remember that case was decided in favor of Lopez. So the Supreme Court did not support the national government to use this clause to regulate firearms in school zones. So to go over it very quickly, the answer to number 14 is D. The answer to number 15 is B. The answer to number 16 is A. All right. Thank you guys for listening.